I am Anne with Stitch Supply, and today we are going to walk you through sewing the Flowering Snowball. First of all, this is the pattern that we will be using, the Flowering Snowball quilt top, and this is available at stitchsupplyco.com. And this pattern will make the quilt behind me in baby, throw, queen, king, twin sizes, so a variety of sizes that you can work on. It is a paper printed pattern that comes with the rulers as well. And these rulers, there are 3 of them: the petal, the background, and the center. And we'll talk about those in a moment. What I love about this pattern, it is a great introduction to sewing curves. They're very gentle curves, and I will give you lots of tips on that. And I also love it because you can fussy cut and use lots of different fabrics. The first thing we'll do is walk through cutting the quilt. And the petal part first, which is the colorful corners. The pattern calls for fat quarters. You can also use quarter yards, but it does take a little bit more fabric, and you can also use scraps, which I highly recommend, and then you just go through and cut as you wish. But for the fat quarters, one of the things that I will recommend when you're cutting out your fabric, no matter if you're using fat quarters or quarter yards, is that you keep the selvage of the fabric parallel to the edge of the ruler or perpendicular, either one. So for example, this would go on here like this, or you're welcome to turn it this way as well. And when I point out turning it, it is important that if you have a directional print, such as these little sheep, and you want them to appear in various spots on the quilt, that you would flip your ruler or rotate your ruler so that sometimes the sheep can be up here and sometimes they can be down in the lower corner. Just something to keep in mind. And when you're cutting out your pieces, I highly recommend using the rulers and a rotary cutter. Rotary cutters generally come in these 3 different sizes. The 60 millimeter is really too big. When you're going around those curves, you'll nick your ruler, and it's harder to use and to get a nice cut. So I do recommend setting that one aside and using either of these 2. They both work great. The little one is a little bit easier, but both work fantastic. When you're cutting, I do advise you to really keep your ruler or your rotary cutter straight up and down. Try not angling it either way, because that will make it a little bit more difficult when you go around the curves, and then we don't want to nick the ruler, and which would also dull our blade. Okay, so simple as that for cutting out that piece. And then we have the background piece, which on mine is white. The piece right here, we're going to use 4 of those for each quilt. And for this, I cut up a strip of fabric. This is the selvage down here, and it's folded in half on this end. And just simply place it on here and then flip it around and sew the other side, or cut the other side, and just keep going down the piece of fabric. The spinning mat is really fantastic for this project because it's hard to reach around and get the angles correct. So I do recommend using your spinning mat. And then the last piece that we're cutting out is just simply this little square. It is a very unique size, so it really does help to have the ruler. If you are going to fussy cut any of these, just keep in mind that it's a diamond shape. You want to fussy cut on point. So now that we have cut out the pieces, let's walk through sewing these curves. I have laid one out here, and each block contains 4 of the background pieces and 4 of the petal pieces in one center. And I have set my machine up to a 1/4 inch. I'm using my 1/4 inch foot. It's not necessary. You can use your standard foot, but we are using a 1/4 inch seam allowance for this pattern. If you're 1/4 inch, try to have more of a scant 1/4 inch, which means a smaller 1/4 inch than the larger. But if your block ends up being a little bit smaller than it should, or maybe things are a little off, it's okay. you can just trim your block. These will finish, or the block will be 10.5 inches trimmed. If you need to trim yours down to 10.25, that's okay. Just try to keep the centerpiece in the center when you're trimming. Okay, so we have our pieces laid out here. I do want you to note that when you lay them out, they don't fit together perfectly, and that is just fine. The curves take in a little bit of that space. So the first step is to sew your long piece from the top to the center to the other petal. And in this pattern, it's very important that you sew and keep that petal always going from the upper left down to the lower right. And we do this in keeping them like that. When we sew all the blocks together, all the seam allowances will nest together perfectly later on. So I really, really encourage you to follow the pressing directions in the pattern. So I'm gonna go ahead and just simply sew these 3 pieces together. Just little straight seams. And I am back stitching at the beginning and end of each seam. So after you have your petal pieces sewn together to the center plate, simply press those pieces to the inside. And it is very important that you follow the pressing directions according to the pattern, so that once you have all the blocks together, when you're sewing all the blocks together, all the seams will nest perfectly. So we're going to sew on the background piece to the main piece. And what I encourage you to do is always keep the background piece on top. And for the first time here, we'll line up the corner. So it's going to look like this, keeping that corner nice and lined up. And go ahead and start sewing. And stop at about 1/4 inch. And I use the needle, this is the needle up-down button on my machine, so that whenever I stop, the needle is always in the down position. And the next thing we do is take and match up the 2 lower corners. And then I just pinch them with my finger. So the job of my right hand is just to pinch that and not let go. And the job of my left hand is I'm going to line up the 2 fabrics gently together. And it's not a tug of war. Just be nice and gentle and let them ease together. And then sew that 1/4 inch seam. And you can shift as you go. And then we backstitched at the other end as well. And then I'm going to bring it over here and iron, and we want the seam allowance now is going to go towards the background fabric. So what I like to do is set out my piece and then just with my fingers press that seam where it needs to go, and then take the iron. So now we have that petal on. Now we're going to sew the petal to the other side, just as we did before, keeping the background fabric on top once again. We're going to go ahead and line up the petal to the background fabric at the point, and it really just lines up on the outside point. And just as we did before, just sewing in a little bit and back stitching with the needle down, and then joining our bottom 2 corners. And then the job of the right hand is to hold those and pinch them together. If you wish to pin that bottom corner, you're welcome to try that. I encourage practicing a few and just do what works for you. Just get comfortable with the feel of sewing around those curves. I use my thumb in there again to line up the edges. And just gently sew around. Oops, I lost my corner. I'm going to reposition those. And then just take that again and press the seam allowance towards the background fabric. So I will go ahead and do that same thing with my other petal. Okay, I have gone ahead and sewn both of the side corners together with the background, and now I'm going to take and sew the petal to the center, or the corner piece to the center piece. And here's where I do use 2 pins. Go ahead and nest these 2 pieces together. You'll have a seam facing the center and out, and I like to put my pins right down the seam allowance and do that with both sides. And you can feel in your fingers just those seam allowances touching each other. And then what we'll do, keeping the background fabric on top, line up those corner pieces again, just like before. And we will go ahead and sew that again. And simply adjusting as you go. And then when you get to your pin, be sure to take that out. I like to glance underneath and make sure my seams are heading in the right direction, my seam allowances. And once you get past that a little ways, go ahead and match up the bottom 2 corners. Pinch that. And then go ahead and press this. When you press this, you'll want the seam allowance to go towards the center square piece. So again, I like to just fold it out and then press it down with my hand. And then we'll do the exact same thing to finish off the final corner. There we have it, and that block is complete. And then when you go ahead and sew 2 blocks together, if you pressed your seams according to the directions, you will be able to nest those edges right together. One other tip I want to give you before I send you off on your own is when you are, a lot of people have asked me, how do you arrange fabrics and to get the order? So there are, in this quilt, there's 19 different fabrics, and the pattern does call for 19 fat quarters for a throw size. So what I like to do is after I've cut all of my fabrics and I have 19 different fabrics laid out, I go ahead and collate them. So they're in an order, and all the fabrics are scattered throughout. And then when I lay them up on the wall, you can just randomly lay them out, or you can choose to lay them out before you start sewing. I use that stack in order so that there will be a random throughout. The different colors will be scattered throughout evenly. So there's one tip I have for you. Practice. Sewing curves is a new technique. If it's a new technique for you, just give yourself be kind to yourself. Be patient. Grab some scrap fabric and practice a few curves and figure out what works for you, how many pins work for you, how to move your hands, and you'll get there. Good luck, and I hope you enjoy sewing your Flowering Snowball quilt.